Greetings, mortals. Today, I talk about hex-crawling. What is it, and how do I do it? Welcome to Tabletop Sandbox, where we talk about all things ttrpg. I actually have an incredibly high-pitched voice. We just record me talking very fast and slow it down. So, what is hex-crawling? Well, it is a style of play in ttrpgs that is heavily focused on simulation and exploration. It's usually a game type where the player characters are making their way through the wilderness, exploring, discovering new monsters, as well as new locations and features, interesting things out in the wilderness of the world. The core element of any good hex crawl is the hex map. The hex map is named as such because it is made up of interlocking hexagons, and each hex represents a standard measure of distance. The usual standard is about 6 miles across, though there are a bunch of different ways that people have done it in the past. You start with a hex map, and as you explore it, you either generate or discover the things, including biomes, ruins, hidden treasure, monsters, that are within it. You can either, as the GM, pre-generate the hex map before the players explore it, or you can generate it as you go. And when I say generate, I'm specifically talking about terrain and sometimes a few key locations. But at least in my opinion, I don't think you should generate every little detail of a hex map before you start exploring. You might just generate the starting town and only have a few ideas about that. But generally, when I'm running a campaign and I want to implement hex crawling, I generate the starting town and then a few key locations that kind of give shape to the map as a whole, and not just make it a indistinct blank page for me, the GM, as well as the players. And that brings me to another note. This might be considered a hot take, but I don't think that the players should gain access to the hex map. Especially if you're using the rules for a chance of getting lost, it doesn't really make sense for them to have the answers. If you give them an in-world handout of a map that somebody has drawn, that's okay, but that acknowledges that the map could be flawed. Just take a look at any map that was drawn before modern surveying and cartography techniques were developed. You'll see what I mean. So you might have pre-generated the terrain, the starting town, and maybe even a few locations. But when it comes to your first session and your player characters are setting out on their exploration adventure, what do you do then? How do you actually run a hex crawl? Well, I'm going to break down a system I use that I got from the Cairn RPG website to use along with Cairn. And in fact, the only 2 hex crawl games I've run are of Cairn, one for a few personal friends and one as a solo campaign that you can check out as live streams I've done on this channel. So to begin, the main engine that drives this method of hex crawling is the watch. There is the early watch from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., the late watch from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and the night watch from 10 to 6. It should be mentioned that at least in Cairn, if you do not take that night watch to make camp, there will be negative consequences. In Cairn, it's fatigue. And another thing that I personally choose to do is at the beginning of every day, so at the beginning of the early watch, I roll on a random chart to generate the weather for the day. I only roll once per day unless there's something that causes a hazard that needs to be rolled and I decide to use a weather hazard. For each of these 3 watches, the players choose an action to take. There are 5. Nope, there are not 5. There are 4 actions that the party might take during any given watch: travel, explore, make camp, and interact. These are broad descriptions of actions. It's describing what they're spending most of their time during that watch doing. Traveling is pretty explanatory. Exploring is when they decide instead of going anywhere, they're just going to stick in the hex that they are in currently and look around. Making camp is also self-explanatory. They make camp for the night, hopefully in a place that is secure or safe from enemies or weather. And interact is probably the biggest blanket one. That is doing anything that isn't covered by the other three. That's stuff like dungeon delving, doing an adventure, or just kind of resupplying in a town or settlement. It could be exploring the lair of a monster, or even just an extended NPC interaction. Say you run into some revelers along the road and decide to take the afternoon to party. And it should be mentioned that all of these actions except interact trigger a roll on the event table to see if anything unexpected happens, either on the way or in the middle of what you're trying to do. More on that event table in a bit. To delve into a little bit deeper depth in each of those actions, for travel, you can travel up to half of your daily speed per watch, or per travel action. The way I run it, with my 6-mile hexes, that happens to be 2 hexes that you can travel during a single watch where you are traveling, which means you can travel up to 4 hexes a day. Though, if they decided to do a forced march and march through the night, I would allow them to do an extra 2 hexes that day, but at, of course, risk of fatigue and potentially other costs. If you have a pre-generated map, or you've just generated the area around here before, you should be describing prominent landmarks or environmental features to your players as they are traversing through the hexes. Something like a tall tower, or a stretch of desert. In fact, whenever I have a party enter a hex, I describe, if they can see, if they're in a position where their vision is not obstructed, like in a forest or surrounded by hills. If their vision is clear, I describe to them the hexes that are all around them, at least the terrain type. And if there's, say, a big tower taller than, maybe 50 feet, I might describe that too. I came up with a probably overcomplicated and unnecessary system of determining speed modifiers for the party's traveling speed. This includes things like dealing with difficult terrain or inclement weather, if you have your party members fatigued, or you're trying to travel stealthily, or if you have something like a vehicle or a mount, what that does to your speed. Some of these are within the party members' control, whether or not they decide to do it. Specifically, there's a forced march option, which allows you to add 1 hex worth of speed per watch, but some of them are completely out of the player's control, like inclement weather that might be rolled up on the chart. Next, if the players are in a situation where their vision over long distances is obscured, I roll a lost chance. This is their chance of getting lost and how lost, or basically how badly they stray from the direction that they wanted to head. I roll on a lost chance if my party members are in a forest within a biome of hills, or in a swamp where the hills or trees or vegetation obscure their view, or if there is obscuring weather like fog or hail or rain or something like that, that makes it very hard for them to see where it is they're going over long distances. Then I have a little bit of extra modifiers here, with there being a minus for additional obscuring factors, like if you were in the forest and it was foggy, or if the party members are fatigued. Then I give a bonus if any party member has an applicable skill set to help them avoid getting lost. If you have a ranger, you're less likely to do so. And if they've gotten directions or have a map, or there's an obviously visible landmark, I give a benefit to them to avoid getting lost. And of course, the biggest bonus is if they're following a road or a river, at least a well-kept road or an obvious river, then they have a really big bonus to avoid getting lost. Damn it, there are 5 actions. I forgot about forage supply. That's basically their option for gathering rations if they're not in a place where they can buy them in a settlement. And you have to take a watch to do that. Forgive me for leaving that out earlier. The way I specifically run forage or supply is that if the party decides to do so, they roll a d6 minus 2, and everybody gains that many rations. So there's the potential for it to be a wasted action, but it's not incredibly likely. When the party decides to use their watch to explore a hex, This is something I really like about this system developed on the Cairn RPG website. They automatically discover something hidden or undiscovered if it is there to be found. So no explore action will be wasted. They will either discover whatever it is, or at least something that is here in this hex, or they will discover that there is nothing in this hex. Making camp, like I said, is pretty self-explanatory. If they manage to do that, they lose all of their fatigue. Next is the interact action. I went into a bit of detail about that already. Exploring a lair, or staying at a settlement, or having an interaction with an NPC, or maybe the most common, dungeon delving. Those count as interactions. In this action, if you are having a non-stressful time, say you're just having a long visit with a wizard NPC and chatting with him at his tower as he works on looking through his library for a specific spell you need. If you're able to rest fully, then you can also lose your fatigue during the interact action. But that doesn't eliminate your need to make camp on an everyday basis, or risk taking fatigue, or deprivation, I believe is what it's called in Cairn. And now we go into a little bit of detail about the event table. This might be called a random encounter table, except that encounters are only a part of it. For all of the options, you have the potential, and perhaps the largest potential out of any of the other options, for it to be quiet, for there to be no event that happens. But for travel, you also have the chance to uncover a location or feature, to encounter a hazard, or to have an encounter. For exploring, you're automatically going to uncover a location or feature if it is there to be found. So there's twice the chance of encountering a hazard, or the chance of encountering an encounter. I should probably say that differently. We'll keep it in. For supplying, there's the chance for it to be quiet, the chance for you to discover a location or feature, the chance to encounter a hazard, or the chance to encounter a monster. I'm saying it the same way as I did before. Basically, I view encounters in this system as being creatures of some kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monster, it could be an NPC, it doesn't have to be a combat encounter, but you are encountering a living creature of some kind when you roll an encounter. And then for camp, there's a larger chance of it being quiet, but then there's also the chance of a hazard or an encounter. Now, I've told you about all these things: hex terrain and locations and features, hazards and NPC and monster encounters, but where do those things actually come from? I said don't flesh out your entire world ahead of time, so where do you get these things? Well, if you aren't already acquainted with them, let me introduce you to the joy of a little something I like to call random tables. I've come up with a slew of random tables for generating locations and/or features in a hex. I have yet to really develop a hazard table or an encounter table, but I've been using Perilous Wilds to do that for me. But let me delve a little bit into the art of random generation, or at least to give you an idea of what these tables are like and what the kind of progression and how I use them actually goes. First of all, for terrain generation, I screenshotted a random chart, I think it was from Pathfinder 2nd edition, online. Basically, you input all the different types of terrain that you want on your map into this table, and then at the very end, you have the largest chance by far for a repeat of the terrain you just generated. My chart is based on a D20. I have plains, hills, desert, forest, mountain, swamp, and aquatic, all having between a 5 and 15% chance of being generated. And then there is a 35% chance that this new hex that you're generating matches the previous hex that you generated. That makes it so that there are kind of clumps of hexes of the same terrain, which makes your map a little bit more believable than if it was just entirely random. My location and feature generation tables are twofold. First, I roll to determine what type of location or feature I will be generating. I have landmarks, resources, that's if there is a resource plentiful in that hex, a structure, a ruin or dungeon, a magical anomaly, a settlement, or nothing, or it is a hidden location or feature. So, once I've rolled on that chart and I determine what's going to be there, then I go to the associated chart with that location or feature type and generate a little bit more specifics. Say I wanted to generate a landmark, and this is actually stolen and altered slightly from Perilous Wilds, which is probably my most used supplement ever, but basically, you can generate a water-based landmark, a plant-based, earth-based, or man-made landmark. And what I mean by that is something obvious, like a megalith, a tower, a dam, something along those lines. For my resources, it's something like edible resources, vegetal resources like herbs, spices, a source of dye, something like that. Or timber or stone, precious metals or gems, or something arcane. For the structures that I could possibly generate, I have a monument, which is kind of similar to a man-made landmark, but I'm okay having that little bit of overlap in my tables. It could be a road or path, a bridge or ford, an active mine or quarry. Could be a homestead, a farm, an inn or roadhouse. It could be a tower, a keep, or estate. Or it could be a sepulcher, which is maybe one of my favorite words, which basically means tomb or crypt or something where there are dead things buried. If I wanted to generate a ruin or dungeon, it could be natural tunnels, catacombs, a ruined tower, keep, or estate. It could be an abandoned mine or a ruined temple. It could be a ruined settlement even. Or, of course, a small, medium, or large dungeon. And now we come to the interesting part where we have subtables within subtables talking about an arcane anomaly. First, I roll to see if this anomaly is arcane, planar, or divine in nature. If it is arcane, it could be the remnants of a spell or ritual. It could be a corruption or blight, an alteration or mutation, or a lingering effect of magic. If this anomaly is planar in nature, it could be a distortion or warp. It could be a gate or tear in the planes, or it could be an outpost of some planar beings in the material realm. And if it's a divine anomaly, it could be a mark or sign, a cursed place, a blessed place, merely a place that's watched by some divine entity, or it could be a presence, something maybe just felt that makes the hair on the back of the PC's neck stand up, or something more obvious than that, like an angel taking a nap. If I wanted to generate a settlement, first I generate the size of the settlement. Is it a village? Is it a town? Is it a metropolis? Then I generate its inhabitants. Are they just plain human? There's the highest chance of that. Are they some monstrous humanoid, like lizard folk or bugbears? Are they perhaps fae or elemental? This could be something like considering elves as fae, or it could be satyrs and nymphs living in a forest. For elementals, it could be dwarves, if you want to go that route with your dwarves, or it could be merfolk, or maybe even treants. It could be undead, or, this one's always interesting to me, it could be constructs that inhabit this settlement. And I also have an option on this table to roll twice and combine those two types of creatures that are living there. I also like to develop a nearby resource for that settlement. If you kind of look at the way towns work, usually they pop up near a resource that they can take advantage of. And these resources that I generate are just kind of a repeat of the resources I mentioned earlier. In fact, you might want to even combine a settlement with that resource if it makes sense to you for there to be a settlement in that hex. I have yet to develop a random dungeon generator, at least with my own tables, but that's because there are so many great resources already out there. And when it comes to hazards and encounters, I've been too lazy to come up with my own, and so I've just been using the Perilous Wilds supplement, which is very useful and like I said, my most used resource. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a video where I dive a little bit further into that. Like I said, some of this is changed from the initial resource that I found on the Cairn RPG website, but most of it is inspired, if not directly copied from that. And thankfully, it's open source, and so I can link to you my specific tables and the resources I use below. Comment below if I'm doing anything terribly wrong, or you just want to share the way that you hex crawl. And if you found this useful, subscribe so you don't miss the next useful video that I put out. And last but not least, good night, mortals.
Okay, are we done?